Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Good morning, some of you still, I think. I'm Michelle Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the International Women's Writing Guild. And today's reading and discussion with Asian women writers is the first that we will be presenting in a global series featuring various themes and identities from women writers in the US and around the world. I want to mention we're really thrilled to launch this panel during the month of May, which is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, paying tribute to the generations of Asian and Pacific Islanders who have enriched America's history and are instrumental in its future success. We certainly pay honor and pay tribute to these writers with us today. I want to thank the IWWG board members, Leslie Newstead and Kelly Dumar, for working with me to shape these panels. And I also want to thank the Poetry Foundation, whose funding is helping support these events. So welcome, everyone. I'm excited to turn it back to Kelly, who will introduce our moderator and guild instructor, Yun Wei. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And congratulations on all the work you've done to get funding for this and other panels to come. So Leslie and I and Michelle had been chatting about the strong call to have a panel of Asian women writers coming up to address some of the concerns after the murder of the 8 people in the 8 Asians in the spa killings. And we happened to come across, there was a synchronistic thing that happened because we were thinking, well, let's ask Yun Wei, who's in Geneva, if she might be interested in moderating this panel. And we quickly gathered up some ideas of some friends of the International Women's Writing Guild and members of the International Women's Writing Guild who might be part of that panel. And Yun's poem happened to appear right at the moment that we were considering arranging this panel. Her poem, Stones Between the Toes I Walked, and it was published on March 25th. And we saw that, and then we reached out to Yun to please moderate the panel, which she enthusiastically agreed to do. And so one of the things we set out as this mission, as this goal for this initial panel, was that we hope to contribute to the visibility of tackling racism towards Asian women and elucidating the issues of Asian American women writers and what they encounter and how the Guild and our community can become more effective allies in supporting and celebrating Asian women writers, changing perceptions in the wider culture based on bias, ignorance, and hate. That was what we were thinking about. And what I want you to picture in our time together this afternoon, this evening, from wherever you are, is that our 44-year-old writing organization for women writers around the world always, for the first decades of its existence, was only 1 week a year, an intensive week-long gathering of women writers in person. And one of the experiences that women writers talk about they remember for their whole lives is this opportunity to be in the audience with other women writers, other women of every walk of life and every age, and then to listen. So to listen to each other's writing at night in the open mics. And this is the spirit of all of our gatherings, is the idea that we've always been a community of listeners, that we've all sat together and been in that hush before the speaker takes the stage and tells her story. And so we're just really committed listeners, and listening to each other is one of the things we really value so much in our community. And that everything in those rooms where we would meet for the open mics was able to be said and able to be spoken. And so the theme that Yun introduced for us to meet on today, writing the unspeakable, is a very moving theme for us to explore today. So I'm super honored to introduce Yun, who has been on our faculty in fiction and poetry now, instructing for the Guild for some years. Yun received her MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College and studied at Georgetown University and London School of Economics. Her poetry and fiction appear in Michigan Quarterly, Shenandoah, Poetry Northwest, Somerset, Wigleaf, and many others. She lives in Switzerland, where she is coming to us today. Yun, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to moderate this panel.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was a beautiful introduction. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. So much of writing is about listening, because that's where we get our material. And I just really wanted to start off by really, I can't thank enough. I mean, Michelle, Kelly, Leslie for organizing this and providing this platform and this safe space for us to share our experiences, you know, and our thoughts and insights through what has been a pretty difficult time. I think I'll just start off this reading, and then right after that, I'll introduce all of this star-studded panel. I can't wait to dive into the discussion with them. I just feel absolutely honored to be here with them. So I thought I would just start with a poem that's from my childhood. And I grew up in Montreal. So yes, I am Quebecoise. And I was part of a Chinese girl dance group where, you know, we performed in, I think, hotels and possibly in Montreal, Chinatown, where our most well-known dance was the turnip dance. I started out as the turnip. Eventually, I got promoted. The turnip dance, Chinatown, 1995. Are we moon faces? Julie asked, while Sheila stretched by the curtains. The knitted red, spandex yellow strapped my legs into columns, standard with spin. Jackie sniffed. She was the turnip. Blown up red cloth and peacock leaves straight out of her neck. I'll be pulling you out, I gleed and tapped the wood. Some shoes were hollow, then grand keyboards, the white nests of dresses. I skipped my eyes over to the curtain slit, Sheila still stretching. Mrs. Huang's lips, goldfish puckered pink. 5, her hands screamed, 4, 3, then slapped and slapped 2, and the turnip wobbled on stage. Mouth pinched with true cherries, I tipped my toes through the curtains. Hill over hill I found of ooed eyes, wiggling noses. Forgetting we were dolls, we pushed our arms and legs out, remembering a shiver, quite ancient, spilling into stares of melody. The second poem I'll read, it's for my father. So Celeste Ning, after the Atlanta shootings, she curated a series for the New York Times of images of what love means to Asians and Asian American photographers. She talked about in that article how, especially during this time, there is a good reason for love to look like worry. And I know that there's no one who worries more about me and who loves me more than my parents. So this poem is for my father, who at one point drove from DC to Philadelphia to pick me up when I got stranded there. And I have to say that it was actually my mother who insisted on coming. So to those who worry about me. Philadelphia, for Dad. Hands on the wheel, as you used to say, and now doing. Frequent posture of profiled nose, glasses perched, back erected from steel plates, a frame small to strangers. You always seemed a giant to me. How deeply are the trees blurring at the window? How much sun turned blue at the touch of a windshield? My first car was yours, still a layer of crushed leaves under the seat, the white hot scrapes from a column I didn't like, the pepper in your hair has turned to salt. My first books were yours, and pens, and paintings that sprout miniature orchestras behind the eyes. Sometimes it's a marching band. Drums, no. Operas, yes. Her crippled wings, Madame Butterfly, still beating in the old stereo. Violins have never set foot in our house, but their shadows touched all the furniture. Leathered wheel in your hands, you can flip miles like pages, and still I pray for salt to quicken the melting of roads between. So my last poem will be the one that really started this whole conversation with Kelly and Michelle and Leslie. I remember I wrote it at 2 a.m. in tears shortly after the hate crimes in Atlanta on March 16th. And I felt it so personally, and I know a lot of people did, and I think a lot of people on this panel did as well. It triggered for me, a lot of memories of this very special form of sexual harassment that's also racist, that I think a lot of Asian women are too familiar with. And because, the stereotypes that tend to come with anti-Asian racism, like the model minority or the objectification of Asian women are considered positive, we're told to take it as a compliment, when really it puts us in harm's way. And so the incidents that I'm referring to in this poem, they happened in Paris, in Geneva, in New York, on the subway. And some of them are from a few weeks ago, some of them from a year ago or longer, but all of them do stay with me. And I don't want to forget about them, even if it makes it easier, because I think that's where, the motivation and that sort of useful rage comes from, I would say. Stones between the toes, I walked, trying to hold my body in the shape of a canvas, a windsail, trying hard not to look so breakable. Tomorrow, a man will buy a gun. 2 weeks ago, I was a konnichiwa. Tonight, my shoes say ni hao, too pretty for a Chinese. 8 blocks it takes me to shake him. He tells me it's a privilege to be wanted. I could be burned from head to stone and still they would call it desire. Tomorrow, a man will walk into a spa. Keys ready at the knuckles, I walked, feeling the hot stones in my pocket of 2 weeks, 1 year, 1,200 ago. From when there were Miram roads, lignite burned to soft coal, and still these streets are not mine. The thing with concrete is it doesn't dent. You don't have to ask what hurt me. Tomorrow, a man will kill 6 Asian women. The difference between a bullet and a chisel is time. No one will tell me when the night ends. Even the man I love doesn't know why I rage, why I crush the things I should have said in my sedimentary mouth, why I wreck everything just to leave a dent the length of a small key. Tomorrow, a man will be believed. Tomorrow, we dive through the wreckage, and the roads will be poured in, broken in, made of us. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening. Now let me introduce you to the panelists that we have, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing their work. So first up, who will be reading is Usha Akela. She has authored 6 books that include poetry and musical dramas. Her newest book, I Will Not Bear You Sons, is published by Spinifex Press Australia in 2021. She earned a master's in creative writing from the University of Cambridge, the UK. She is the founder of Matwala, the first South Asian Diaspora Poets Festival in the US, and hosts the POV.com, an interview and conversations website. Welcome, Usha. Over to you. I think you're on mute.
All right. Hello, everyone. Namaste. Thank you so much, Win, Kelly, Leslie, Michelle, everyone at the Guild, and all my co-panelists I'm very, very honored to be here, very humbled, and really looking forward to listening to all of you and learning from your experiences. I'd like to begin with just a few notes I've jotted down about my journey as a writer, and I will follow up with a poem or two depending on the time we have. All poetry aims at capturing the unsaid as said. The poem becomes a pulsating and breathing thing birthed in the liminal spaces of inner experience. Poetry is a courageous art. It ventures under the skin into the minefield of human emotions as a valid record of human history. Poetry, specifically in the voice of the feminist poet, speaks the unspeakable. The pen is a sword of fire that must cleave, funnel, forage, and burn to reveal silent histories. I found my voice metaphorically with the poem about arranged marriages in 1994 titled No, the first poem written for my first book, Kali Dances, So Do I. That group of poems was relentlessly autobiographical, inescapably feminist, peppered with mythology and self-affirmation, exploring my Neogi Brahmin identity. I had a story to tell, and I wanted the world to listen. So No paradoxically resounded yes, as it affirmed my voice. Early on, I understood I had to define my own feminism too. I was uneasy with the term confessional to denote a type of poetry women write, a term pregnant with associations with Christianity, guilt, and subservience to male authority. I preferred the time autobiographical, as women should not confess, but own and speak their truths. As a South Asian woman poet, I learned to formulate and empower the self through articulation of my untold or unspeakable stories curtailed by patriarchy in the larger event of truth making. I learned my poetry could tell truths truer than fact, when it alchemized the unspeakable and unspoken with the magic of language, when words became the vessel to hold intangible and complex realities. I am inspired by many women poets like Sharon Olds, Anne Sexton, Pramila Venkateshwaran, Sylvia Plath, and Kamala Das that embrace the entirety of a woman's psyche rooted in the body. My newest book, titled I Will Not Bear You Sons, published by Spinifex Press, makes a statement that the issues I tackle are valid subject matter for poetry. Issues like foot binding, FGM, myth, rape, mysticism, politics, terrorism, etc. I attempt to mirror a narrative of patriarchy reflected all over the globe and a journey of selfhood that as an Indo-American immigrant with these poems. Organizationally, Matwala is the festival I launched to promote the visibility of South Asian poets. Matwala 2021 recognizes the urgency of extending our solidarity with poets of color in the heightened political and social climate of intolerance and hate we're all witnessing. We're hosting individual readings through 2021 and 2022 with African American, Native American, Asian American, Mexican, South, Central American, and Dalit poets. Indeed, the time urgently calls for poets to create and propagate platforms for the unspeakable to be spoken. So those were just a little bit about my poetics. And I want to dedicate this poem to the Asian American community and to all my panelists. It's one of the poems in this book, and it's about foot binding. And I think it's a relevant forum to read that today. It's called Lotus Feet. Whatever the narrative, whatever the century, she shrinks. These are the feet of the sentence laid out bare, a tale to tell, tall feet between the crushed bones of centuries, between the tendons of Tang, Han, and Song. Language is pompous, ballooning for a conquering mind. 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms ended in a song, so it seems, a mouthful of syllables jingling in the mouth, names of dynasties too long to quote or remember. Long, long lines of glory, phallic strides, mountainous thrusts in art. This is one unbroken, uncrushed narrative, but something is shrinking imperceptibly. Beauty is in the eye of the masculine beholder, whose gaze says, make her small, small, smaller, till she cannot stand. So perfect, so beautiful, so dainty. Imagine moonbeams for feet and lotuses for footprints. A mere 4 inches, and the male ego erects in desire. I am a teapot. I hiss, I pour a bitter tea on my dainty feet. On my dainty feet, I hiss, I pour a bitter tea. So that's about foot binding, a very, very horrific custom that really broke my heart as I read about it. I'm going to end with a poem called Enough. People, let us say it. Bring back our caged children to a field of sunflowers. Open our land to people as we would our palms to catch a raindrop. Bring back Alan in blue shorts, washed up as a fish snuggled in sand. Let us not say again he did not make it. Let children not have to tell their stories. Let us bring back Gulsoma, 7 years old, oil her back scarred like a cluster of sardines. Let us hear her laughter before she was married. Let Malala not be shot in the head. Let Carla not have to say 43,200 times raped. And bring back Asifa Bano's rosy cheeks and chirping. Let her bring back goats barefooted and roast warm chestnuts on a humble fire. Let her 8-year-old legs not be parted brutally for things other than what children do. And bring back all the murdered girl infants, still as stone swaddled in earth. And the police, traffickers, abductors, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, who kill, sell, abuse, rape, shoot their own. Let us hang them as rotting fruit from trees. And people, we who know too much with our tentacles of knowing, like octopuses with many eyes, how much of knowing do we need before we say it enough? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Usha. I think I'm still reeling from that powerful reading. And I loved what you said about, the intangible, because I do think poetry has that quality to be able to describe something that is intangible and sometimes also just too horrible to speak about. But I think I would love to talk about that more once we get into the discussions. Next up is Ada, who will be reading. So Dr. Ada Chang is a professor turned storyteller and storytelling show producer. She uses storytelling to illustrate structural inequities, engage social critiques, and build intimate communities. Welcome, Ada.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This piece is called That I'm Not Be Your 10, Trigger Warning, Sexual Assault. So I'm going to read it because it's self-explanatory. It took me 10 years. Last year, I was invited by a professor from the Global Asian Studies program at UIC to do presentations for his Asian American courses. The presentation was entitled Sexual Assault on College Campus and Asian American Experiences. This presentation was different for 2 reasons. It was the first time that I presented for college classes with predominantly Asian American students. Staring at faces similar to mine hit me viscerally. It was also the first time that I did something very different with my materials. I started my talk with the following. The American colonization in Asia. her military and political interventions in the Asian region, and the United States and Western racist and imperialist legacy in Asia. The constructed images of Asian women as docile, submissive, exotic, sensual, and sexually willing, and the sexual fetishization of Asian American women. The symbolic and cultural emasculation and desexualization of Asian American men. The necessity to center race in sexual assault discourse. Why are racialized images central to our understanding of sexual assault? If you are perceived to be submissive, docile, sensual, and exotic, is it possible that your objections, even if they're firm, can be disregarded over and over? Is it possible that if you're perceived to be sexually willing and available, your rejections can be fantasized in a twisted way to mean affirmations? Immediately after the class, a student approached me and said, "Thank you for your presentation. You made this material relevant to my experiences." I knew what she meant. She didn't mean my presentation was relevant to her as a woman. She meant it was relevant to her as an Asian woman. Her remark shook me to my core, not only in terms of how I should do training on gender-based violence in the future, but also how I had to re-examine my own sexual assault. I had to ask myself, why did I leave out certain details? Why was my identity as an Asian woman never given a proper place in my own public account of the story? My sexual assault took place in 2010. He was a colleague of mine in the department at a well-known university in Chicago. He was a friend, a progressive faculty, and a comrade, one who would march with women and speak up for us. Yet he sexually assaulted me despite my repeated rejections. I couldn't even name it as rape until another colleague of mine named it for me. I have told this story in public a few times since 2016. I left out something important. I decided not to discuss race in the story to mitigate the stereotyping that might ensue. My colleague is an immigrant man of color, a member of a marginalized community. I left out that detail because of the larger political climate of our time. In 2015, when Donald Trump came out running for presidency, his campaign relied on demonizing immigrants, particularly immigrant men of color. I didn't want this to become another statistic contributing the portrayal of immigrant men of color as the villain in our larger cultural and political landscapes. Since I didn't name his race, I didn't explore how my own race might have played a part in my own victimization. I've been troubled by my own omission, since my racial identity as an Asian woman has been central in my existence as an immigrant woman of color in this country, and my experiences as an immigrant woman of color faculty member in academia. In a way, my colleagues have dismissed my presence, appropriated my intellectual labor, and discounted my contributions. In a way, my students have disregarded my authority as a tenured faculty member. And in a way, I have been told to go back to my country and consistently asked where I'm from originally, even after I became a citizen in 2015. How could race be so salient in all my experiences as an immigrant woman of color, yet so absent at this moment of intimate violation? What other pernicious effects can this erasure of race have? What I didn't say to students in 2020 is this: is it possible that because of these images developed and constructed out of American racist, colonial, and imperialist legacies, you will be perceived as a complicitous collaborator in your own sexual assault, not only by others, but also by yourself? Is it possible that we also come to see ourselves as complicit in the violence against us? I did, questioning myself in terms of the legitimacy of the rape, because there was no brute force, because it was not in the dark alley, because he was no stranger to me, but someone I trusted, because I didn't fight back and yell, because I thought I was trying to salvage a friendship, and because I stayed quiet and let it go afterwards, pretending nothing had happened. Exactly the same way I dealt with anti-Asian racism early on in my life in this country. On March 16, a white man murdered 8 people in Atlanta, among them 6 Asian women. In the press conference, the sheriff minimized the violence against these Asian women by labeling it as the shooter's trouble with sexual addictions. Within 1 month of my arrival in this country in 1991, I learned a particular form of racial profiling unique to me as an Asian woman via this phrase: I like Asian women. This phrase has been said to me millions of times throughout decades by men of all races, particularly white men. The key word here is Asian, not woman. Men are looking for a particular set of titillating images and stereotypes in me. I am not important. The collective we that they have been fantasizing is what satisfies their sexual desire. I'm never just a woman. I have always been an Asian woman. In an effort to protect my perpetrator, I never once asked how my identity as an Asian woman might have played a role in his repeated refusals to accept my rejections. I obscured the fact that I had consistently experienced racialized misogyny and sexism from men of color. Still, until this day, I don't know how to address harm done to one another within marginalized communities. I wrote myself, the inseparable Asian woman, out of my own narratives. When you write yourself out of your own stories, there's no story to tell about you or for you. It took me 10 years. Let it not be your 10. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ada. I think I told myself I wasn't going to cry during this panel. I think that ship has sailed. It was just so incredibly brave of you to share that with us, and it was so powerful. I mean, I think it takes such a huge amount of courage to overcome, all of the things that prevent us from naming it for what it is, because there are a lot of obstacles there, but that is the start. Once we have words for it, then we can have action. Thank you, Ada. Our next reader is Michelle. So Michelle Liu is a student at Brown University who's passionate about storytelling. She is the co-founder of Red Envelope Stories and has been featured by the Boston Globe, CBS News, and NPR's All Things Considered. She writes about her personal Asian American experience and shorter works of fiction. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, thank you everyone, and thank you so much for the panelists and sharing their personal stories. As Yoon said, I am the co-founder of RedEnvelopeStories.net, where we collect different stories about the Asian American experience and really highlight the intersectionalities and nuances of what we go through every day. And so what I want to do is start off with this piece I wrote for public radio and then transition into some of our readers submitted stories. Anyone can submit to our website. It's just redenvelopestories.net. So I just want to highlight the different experiences people from all over the world who are a part of the Asian American AAPI community have shared with us. So this essay I wrote actually took place right after the Atlanta shootings that we've been talking about, like Ada mentioned, and I took the time to really reflect upon my Asian American identity. Even as a child, I remember wanting to be white. I didn't have the vocabulary then, but there was a sense of inferiority I associated with my Asianness. This hollowed out feeling arose whenever my mother spoke in broken English to the store cashier, or when I ate from my Zoji Rushi lunch thermos packed with rice, or when the guys in my class said they would only date white girls. My parents immigrated here in 1989 with no more than $500, even less according to my father. Whenever I brought up any of my racial qualms, my mother would say, your grandfather, who I called Lao Ye, climbed 3 mountains without shoes to go to school every day. Both his mother and father passed away when he was a teenager. Lao Ye would become a CEO and travel to over 50 countries. My problems paled in comparison. With a mental image of my grandfather, I began placing academics ahead of my grapplings with race. In my freshman year at Brown University, I planned on majoring in statistics, but because of our school's open curriculum, I also decided to take my first sociology course with Professor Isik-Jean. It was called Race, Class, and Ethnicity in the Modern World. His research and all his data fascinated me. And when he mentioned how the Asian American population in the United States could use further exploration, I took the opportunity to propose a project with him. Our goal was to discover how Asian Americans fit into the racial and class structure of our country. I worked with thousands of cases of Asian Americans and understood their lives through data. And I saw how Asian Americans who were allowed to immigrate to the United States have higher levels of income and education. They're heralded for their hard work and attainment of the American dream. Under the guise of the model minority myth, the illusion of equality and prosperity in our country is sustained. But it is an illusion. At the start of the coronavirus pandemic, I witnessed how Asian Americans can still be deemed as foreigners in the same place that heralds their success as the cause of others' failures. The surge in hate crimes in our country shows that Asian Americans are still first and foremost seen for their skin color. The news article from which I learned about the killings in Atlanta said the shooter's motive was unknown. He was a sex addict who hated women, right? I had a fleeting thought that race could have also been a coincidence in this case, that the situation was complicated. There were so many factors involved in this tragedy, and I could no longer ignore that race was the driving one. For all the times I was hurt, scared, enraged, and struggling with internalized racism, I finally come to recognize who I am in America, an Asian woman. It's a lot to take in, all the recent violence, and the realization that's the right thing to challenge unjust systems. That's right to address racial inequalities and call discrimination by its name. So that was the short essay I wrote for public radio, but I think it was also the launching pad and catapult for starting a lot of the work we did with Red Envelope Stories, our weekly newsletter. And we received submissions that touch upon a lot of different things about the Asian experience, not just wanting to be white or eating different types of food. I think our experience can't just be reduced to just being Asian. It's a part of our identities, but it affects us in so many different ways that relates to who we are as a whole. So I just want to share a few stories that readers have submitted to us. I call my yeye several times a year, usually during the holidays when he sends me gifts in the mail. Our calls always follow the same structure. I say hi, he asks which one of his grandchildren is calling. I thank him for the gift. He asks me if I'm at home or at school. Then we finish. 3 minutes of his Chinese and my English going head to head until one of us no longer has any idea what the other is saying. I've never been super close to my yeye or any of my grandparents for that matter, but I feel overwhelmingly guilty that I can't hold a real conversation with him. Aside from a couple of basic English words, he only speaks Mandarin Chinese. You would assume I can as well, given that both my parents can speak it, but you'd be wrong. I picked up more Spanish in 3 years of high school instruction than I did Chinese across 8 years of weekend school. Embarrassing. I don't know why I resisted it for so long, but I finally come around to learning Chinese more seriously. Perhaps I've just realized that's for my own good to be able to communicate with my yeye before it's too late. Either way, I'll be enrolling in a beginner's Chinese course next semester to pick up where I left off, since my official Chinese class in 2015. Hopefully my Chinese New Year call with yeye can last 4 minutes this time around. And I'm gonna choose another one, and it's submitted by an Asian American woman. I refuse to date East Asian men or white men for fear of becoming a trope. The tired image of the East Asian woman who only dates within her race, or arguably worse, the East Asian woman who falls for white supremacy. This extends to platonic relationships too. Fall semester, I'm invited to join a study group for a college math class. And when I join the Zoom, every student on our call is East Asian. We compare answers for half an hour. After that first call, I never joined again. I'm not sure if I'm more embarrassed to be seen in a group of solely East Asian American people, or if I'm more embarrassed by the shame I feel when surrounded by my own heritage. And then this next one's really short, but it really resonated with me. I grew up eating raw eggs with rice for breakfast. It was the fastest meal I could eat while preparing to leave the house for school. That is, it's less time consuming than taking a slice of bread and putting it in the toaster and waiting for it to be ready to be served. Coming to the United States, I realized no one eats raw eggs, especially because there might be microorganisms that could be pathogenic. I feared that my non-Asian friends would judge me for what I have been eating all my life. So I'm just gonna read 2 more, and this one's also about food, and I think it's very personal to the Asian American culture, the Asian culture. I hate persimmons. I like them as fruit, but I loathe what they represent. When I was younger, my grandparents would always babysit me. As any loving grandmother would do, my grandma would cut up dozens of her homegrown persimmons for me after school. Whenever I brought friends over, she would persistently offer us a fruit, saying in her Filipino accent, "Palanga, love, you and your friend eat a snack. Have some persimmon. Eat." I knew my non-Asian friends had never seen persimmon, and this was confirmed by their puzzled faces when they glanced at the orange crescents on the plate. I was embarrassed. They must think I'm weird because I eat weird food. And why does my grandma have to call me that? And why does she have to shove food down our throats? In middle school, I learned to run up the stairs when I brought a friend over to avoid the interaction with my grandparents. I can no longer enjoy persimmons. Now when I look at one, I remember how I was ashamed of my grandparents and how I tried to hide them from my friends. And I'm going to read one more, and I think this one really resonates with me. Growing up, mental health wasn't a thing we talked about. There was no such thing as anxiety. That was what you got from thinking too much. There was no such thing as depression. That was for privileged white kids who were too bored with their lives. Americans are over-medicated and therapists are for crazy people. Don't worry, no one in our family could ever be crazy. It took moving out and getting on my own health insurance to see that it can be helpful to talk about your feelings with an external person. That regardless of what I was going through, my feelings are valid and they deserve respect. That even if my life is not as hard as that of someone growing up in communist China, my struggles are real. The pressure to succeed in an Asian family can be immense and can have lifelong implications for how you view the world. Try to take some time to process everything. You'll be better off in the long run. So that's all for me. And anyone here can submit to Brown Envelope Stories. The website is just brownenvelopestories.net, and feel free to subscribe for great content about the AAPI experience.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I related to so much of that. I think like each of those pieces, and I love this idea of these sort of bite-sized stories that can fit in a red envelope that I think we can all relate to. And it was beautifully read. So our final reader is Sarah. Sarah Liu is a young adult novelist. Her first book, The Best Lies, was published by Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers in 2019, and her untitled second is slated for publication in 2023. In her spare time, she paints watercolors and makes YouTube videos to explore one of her biggest passions, mental health. She currently resides in Birmingham, Alabama with her husband and 2 dogs. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so moved by all of the powerful voices that I've heard today. It's such an honor to be on this amazing panel. I'm going to be reading 2 things. One is a page from my novel, The Best Lies. The main character in this book is named Remy, and she's an Asian American teen. And here she's talking about her brother Christian and how their experiences of essentially the model minority myth and how it differs for them. Christian was Riverside famous. Everyone at school seemed to have a crush on him, from the captain of the volleyball team to the president of speech and debate. Even Melody, who considered boys a waste of time, was drawn to his good looks and stellar grades. But he was more than grades and academic extracurriculars. He'd been class president every year until he ascended to student council president his senior year. He played 3 varsity sports, was the captain of the basketball team, and was being recruited by coaches at Brown and Princeton. Christian was like our mom, constantly working to surpass that Asian American stereotype. Mom was always telling us that we were American just like everyone else. She liked to remind people that both she and Dad had been born stateside, and once, when drunk, she delivered a rambling speech at the dinner table on the Japanese internment, even though we weren't of Japanese descent. They locked up people who looked like us, she said, pointing to her face. Did they round up Germans or throw Italians into internment camps? No, of course not. 2/3 of those interned were born here, but that didn't matter. My grandmother wore a pin that said, "I'm Chinese, not Japanese," every day for years, every single day for years, because she was afraid they'd take her store and ship her off by accident. It was like she wanted to wear pins that said, "I'm American, not Chinese," like it was still necessary to prove we belonged here. All of this stuck with Christian, but never quite affected me in the same way. Maybe because he was a stereotypical academic overachiever. He felt like he had to prove he wasn't only that. Just like Mom, who was a doctor, a brain surgeon. Maybe I never felt that kind of pressure because any success at school I'd experienced was owed to Melody. But Christian, everyone wanted to be him or be with him. He was golden, could do no wrong, but more important, he was respected and loved. In our family, the lines had been drawn early, Christian and Mom, me and Dad. Mom never bothered to hide the fact that she favored Christian, her perfect everything. The flagship child, she called him once as a joke. He was going places and I was going nowhere. So that sort of summarizes how difficult it can be for Asian Americans who experience the model minority stereotype, where one of the siblings fits that stereotype and is sort of succeeding, but also wants to surpass it. And the other sibling who sort of can't measure up, and how she's constantly being compared to that stereotype. And then the other part of that reading I liked was the discussion of how, as East Asians, she may not have been of Japanese descent, but she suffered along with the sort of racism that was experienced during the Japanese internment era, and how now, it's there, the conversation may be about the China virus or anti-Chinese, but really all East Asians, anyone who looks like us, are impacted. And that's because the experience we share here in America is one of marginalization because of the way we look. The second thing I'm going to read is an excerpt from an essay that I had written in response to the spa killings. I grew up in Atlanta. I'm actually in Atlanta right now. I'm in my parents' basement. And so what had happened in Atlanta in March had really impacted me. I grew up in this very community that had been experiencing this violence. So here's the excerpt from the essay that I wrote. This past week, I've been reflecting on the racism I've experienced and reading stories from fellow Asian Americans on their experiences. A couple things jumped out at me. One, I'd never realized that every single instance of street harassment I'd experienced also had a racial element. The men who stalked my friend and me for several blocks shouting obscenities, come-ons, and ching-chong noises. The time I was called geisha. And two, class and privilege matter, but they'll never fully protect you. One of the more shocking experiences for me was when I was still at college, standing maybe 20 feet from my dorm, talking to two friends who were also Asian American women. A group of men, fellow college students, stood on their fraternity porch shouting ching-chong nonsense and screaming at us to go the fuck back home, over and over. This was at Penn. These were well-off, educated white men. All of these experiences, all forms of racism and misogyny and bigotry, are rooted in the same thing, dehumanization, rooted in looking at us and deciding that we don't deserve full participation in this world because we are less than human. It is a failure to recognize the humanity in someone who looks different. It's seeing yourself and your experiences, your joy and your pain as real, and being unable to see someone else's experiences, their joy and their pain as real. The recent spike in violence and harassment against API has brought me back to that feeling as a kid where I desperately, desperately wanted not to be Asian. And it cut open something within me, and I've begun to remember and replay all the racism I'd ever experienced in a horrific loop. I hadn't realized how much I'd buried, brushed off, and normalized, because this is what we've had to do to survive. To take the racist abuse and swallow it, avoid drawing too much attention to ourselves, our pain, to say, I'm lucky it wasn't worse. To not ask too much of this country so we can continue calling it home. And so we take it and we bury it deep within us, and we hope nothing ever opens the floodgates to that pain until finally something does. I want to be honest about my experiences and my messy feelings, about how impossible healing seems in this moment for me, when the anger and the fear and the grief are overwhelming and it feels like we might never surface from under them. Maybe the feelings we have right now are too painful, too raw for healing in this moment, and the act of healing in an open or outward way can seem like giving in to what other people want. It can feel like our emotions and pain are the only things we have to make others really look at us, see us as human. And it can feel like if we try to heal this pain, we are giving up, reconciling with white supremacy, or even in a sense, letting the racists win. But one day, not today and not next week, we will have to look at our own grief and anger and fear and know that holding on to that pain, that letting the jagged shards of our broken hearts cut us again and again is an act of self-harm, and in essence, they will have won. That we will have let them turn us bitter and angry, scared and devoid of hope, always experiencing the world and asking ourselves if the person we're interacting with is racist or intends to hurt us because of the way we look. That we will have diminished our lives and ourselves in the face of their violence and become less than fully human by living less than full lives, having less than full dreams, and always wondering if we'll ever fully belong. I don't want this to become our destiny. I don't want this for my parents, my brother, my closest friends, or any children I might have. I want us to be whole because we deserve wholeness. We deserve healing. We deserve to be fully human, to belong to this society, this country, this planet. We deserve so much more than the ways they have tried to flatten us or make us small so that they can more easily commit acts of violence against us. We are not victims or victims in waiting, and we will not let their hate define us. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. That was so eloquently put. I mean, dehumanization, I think that's a word that I want to hold on to as we go into this discussion. It was just so well expressed. Dehumanization, and I guess I think like the starting point a lot of the time is also generalization, lumping individuals together and then assigning certain stereotypical characteristics based on how they look. And I think, as Ada, you had said, you know, it doesn't even matter if you are a citizen or if you're third generation, fourth generation, or fifth, there will still be that questioning of where are you really from? And I know I've also, even as a writer, sort of struggled with this. I've avoided writing about my background at times, not wanting to be too Asian. I've been told I wasn't Asian enough. I've been told once I do start writing about it, you know, why is it always about race? So it's sort of like a constant struggle. So what I'd like to start off to ask the panel is to ask you about, you know, what are the specifics about your identity as a writer and as an Asian woman that you would like us to know? Let's start off with Usha, and then we'll go to Ada, Michelle, and then Sarah.
Thank you, Yoon. Thank you. It was just really wonderful, very moving to listen to all of you. I'll take those stories with me, and it will take me some time, I think, to really settle down. So thank you. I think you've brought, I think most of you have touched upon something that's, I think, very incisive, that there isn't just one identity. There's not just one Chinese identity or Japanese identity and so on. So just to share some complexities about India, you know, we have scripturally 4 main castes, and which have generated, I'm reading, about 3,000 castes and 25,000 subcastes. We are 29 states. We have 19,500 languages, 22 official languages, and at least 8 religions. So being Indian is not just one homogeneous identity. You know, we come from a state, we speak a language, then there's a caste system that affects our upbringing and our thought processes and shapes our sensibilities and our consciousness. And then you add the whole experience of immigration to that. You're Indo-American as well. So, you know, that big fragmentation happens. You move away from the motherland. You're resettling yourself with all this complexity, and you have to appear seamless and one on the outside. But the wonderful part of it is you have all that fodder to write about, you know. So I come to see it really as a blessing. I don't see it as something negative anymore. I think this is a very complex, rich, there's such rich material to write from. And I try to tap into that while I'm exploring my poems of identity or you know, the articulation of the self, or whatever it is that happens in my poems. I have all this complexity to write from. So I choose to see it as a blessing. I choose to see immigration as a blessing, because we're also living at a time in history, I think, where none of us have ever had such freedom to carve, sculpt, choose, delineate exactly the way we would like to live, the lifestyles we want. I can leave certain baggage back in India. I don't have to carry them over. I can choose what to have, maybe have pasta for lunch and then Chinese food for dinner. I mean, at no part, I think, in human history have we had this freedom of choice. Of course, I know it's probably there, you know, there are exceptions, and there's no blanket statement about anything. But we're also at a very incredible time in history where there is a certain luxury of choice that immigration brings. So I don't know if that answers the question fully, but that's a bit of it that's important for me as a poet.
Great, thank you. Ada?
Thank you so much. I was an academic for 15 years, and I started if I get emotional, just me being Ada, I cry all the time on shows, just me. So, and I'm easily emotionally engaged, and I have no shame in crying in public. I started telling story in January 2016, and being an artist, as a writer and storyteller, it is important for me to tell my stories, particularly intersectional identities, and not just in terms of a gender, race, but also class, education level, sexuality. But one thing that I find really important is in my own work, producing platforms for people to tell their stories. I know by telling stories, oftentimes I'm also speaking to a very specific audience, sometimes middle class white audience. And I don't want my stories be the only one heard. Exactly Usha's point that there's such difference, disparity within the Asian American community. And it is important for us to really hear everyone's perspectives and experiences. So we know the differences not just between Asian American community and other groups, but also within the Asian American community as well. And the other thing that I really try to do in my own work is to wrestle both the oppression and privileges at the same time, right? And that is, as much as I talk about oppression, I also talk about how oppression might be mediated through our own privileges. And the point is, privileges don't cancel out our oppression. It simply make our oppression different. And so the question is, how do we balance that? And I'm going to stop here. I'm going to answer more questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, I really liked what Ada said about, the oppression not being like canceled out because of the privileges you experience as an Asian, especially because a lot of Asian Americans are hyper-selected to come to the United States. They do have those privileges of being an immigrant and maybe having higher levels of education or a different background than people, other races. And so, when Yoon was asking, what are the specifics you want others to know about your identity, I think being Asian or being Chinese American is one part of the picture. Really focusing on the intersectionalities is what's, I think, important. Being Asian is only one part of the story. It's not just being Asian. Like it's one part of your identity that you can offer through your writing, and there's other parts of your identity, whether that's your sexuality, class, gender, that are also important to touch upon. And ultimately, you by coming to terms with your Asian identity, you can also just understand yourself as a whole that much better.
The layers, yeah, absolutely. Sarah?
I apologize in case you hear my dogs barking. I was like, honey, can you get that? For me, I think that so I come from like an immigrant background where, I was born in China. I came here at the age of 4. So I don't really speak or read Chinese, and I feel very American, but my parents definitely have that immigrant story. And for me, I think because of my experiences growing up and not being able to find a lot of stories that were that featured Asian American characters or movies or media in general, I'm sort of looking and hoping that my contributions as a writer will be to shape narratives going forward that will include characters who happen to be Asian but don't necessarily have to follow that immigrant story, which I think that is super important. And I think for a while, publishing, especially in children's publishing, was doing a lot of immigrant stories and immigration stories, assimilation or cultural differences, and that was really important. But it also, I think, can sometimes perpetuate the perpetual foreigner type stereotype for Asian Americans, that our story is primarily one of constant foreignness, of being in here, that like every generation there's always Asian immigrants, when like Yoon had said earlier, there are some who have been here 3, 4, 5 generations. And for me, I'm really looking toward the future in terms of looking for narratives and trying to shape narratives that are about our political identity, how our experiences here are unified because of our race and not necessarily because of our cultural or immigration differences. So that's how it informs my work.
Brilliant. I mean, and also just going back to what Usha had said, I mean, I come from actually like a minority group in China, so that, you know, that has actually probably an older language than Mandarin. And sometimes it almost just seems too difficult to explain. And you know, sometimes like you don't have the energy or the time sometimes to confront that and explain all of that. I do want to move to this question. I'm just seeing there are a bunch of questions, great questions in the chat. I guess somebody had asked around the writing, and I think I'm going to go to, so I guess for us, you know, right now.
The question, Yun, how do you as writers work to subvert the dehumanizing generalization? That is the assumption of universal truth and or default bodies in literature. How does this intersect with your resistance to the external pressure to write about your race?
It's honest. I think I mentioned before, I feel like it's a constant struggle, and it's quite exhausting because I feel like you're constantly thinking about, you're doing the mental calculation of how people are seeing you and whether or not you're being boxed in. I don't know if others from the panel can share about that.
I think for me, I kept on trying to imagine myself writing as an abstract, disembodied subject. And is that even possible? That's my question. And so I tell my stories and write. Inevitably, it is related to my identity as an Asian American immigrant, Taiwanese, LGBTQIA. And I try to imagine myself to write out of nowhere. And the truth is we cannot write ourselves out of nowhere. Even the literature that seems to speak to the universal truth is always spoken from a particular positionality and experiences, except whiteness is unnamed, right? Whiteness is being seen as the universal truth. And so all of us, if we speak from Asian American, Black American, Latino American, that it is as if only we have positions, that only we carry bodies. But the truth is, white people have bodies too. And I think for me, it's how do we challenge that assumption of the embedded whiteness as the invisible element that we need to name. And so for me, I have no problem telling stories and label it as specifically Asian American stories. But specifically, I want to say Asian American stories are also American stories. And what I want to do is make it normalize and make it mainstream. And I also want to caution that a lot of stories, there's a class issue. Oftentimes it's talking about white class element, right? And so the race is oftentimes unnamed. And so let's be very careful about the so-called universal truth, oftentimes simply represent the invisible whiteness. That is oftentimes the ground that we use to judge all other types of writing.
Right, absolutely, Ada. And I think you had also made the point earlier about what we've internalized. And I mean, I have to say, it's just, yes, the white literature is considered as it's much more well known. It is more considered universal. Everyone knows who Shakespeare is and all of this. And I think to switch that, to create sort of a foundation that is strong enough to also be considered universal does take an incredible amount of effort. I feel like I do it too. I will reach out for that familiar story on the bookshelf because I know it, because that's what I grew up with. But then trying to deconstruct that and break that down and questioning myself, why do I prefer to read about a culture that is familiar to me? I think that is also like work that we do ourselves. But I love what you said about sort of the way you're writing. I think at this point, you do reach a certain point where you just write what you write, and to not care how you're being seen and how that's going to be interpreted, of whether you'll be too Asian or not enough. I think that's sort of the best I can say about that. Now, I think let me move on to sort of another question. We're here. We have this great platform to speak about this. But the fact is that, anti-Asian racism is nothing new. If anything, you can date it back to, written into US law with the very first immigration law with the 1875 Page Act. So why do you feel, I'm asking the panel here, like, do you feel like there is a culture of silence and invisibility around racism against Asians specifically? And if you do think that, why is it and how do we break it?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. There definitely is. When I was speaking to news outlets such as like the Boston Globe and CBS, my mom, she called me and she said, don't say anything too extreme. People might look you up, or just be careful what you say. And in a way, she wasn't trying to silence me, but she was trying to say, don't threaten any social order. And I think the reason why we sometimes remain complacent or silent is with those privileges we have as Asian Americans. Sometimes, we're not at the bottom of the racial totem pole. So even though we're not completely equal with maybe the people at the top in power, we don't want to threaten our position of, being in the middle. We're not like at the very bottom. And so you kind of just ignore the injustices and the subtle microaggressions that you might experience. I think also the disadvantages and the discrimination against the Asian community is really masked by our high levels of education and usually like socioeconomic success. So when you look at the data, like Asian Americans are very likely to be in the upper middle class or middle class like normally, but there's really great disparities within our own community. And not only that, like we came here with higher levels of education, so it makes sense that someone with PhDs who immigrated here would have a higher socioeconomic position. And I think I think sometimes people don't delve into why that's the case. And they're like, in pursuit of the American dream, we are successful, so everything should be fine, we should be quiet. And I think when you actually look at what's going on and delving deeper into like you said, like the history of Asian American hate, it really surfaces that we are still always sort of viewed as perennial foreigners.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think I hate the fact that a tragedy had to sort of spark this kind of this level of outspokenness. I mean, it was definitely building up for a while, I think, but in a sense, it can also like unify us and bring some solidarity between us as far as speaking up and supporting each other to speak up when it is really difficult. And for the people who are in a position to speak up about that. I want to go to a question that's in the chat. So how much do you think gender drives the racism and violence? So we've clearly talked about the intersection of the two. What is happening there? Ada, would you like to speak on that next?
Absolutely. The interesting thing is we have been at least on college campus or we're talking about a particular form of sexual harassment, right, against Asian women on college campus. So that has been a topic for a long time. And so for those of us who are doing this work, that when we look at particular harassment or hatred or catcall or violence, that these two, whether it is that gender race, they're always combined, right? You cannot separate that. This is simply about this person of a particular race or this person particular because of the gender, that they are all together. And sometimes that we miss that, that because we hear the anti-Asian racism, when we think about racism, we might think about Asian men or men in general, or the universal abstract subject. But it surprised me that it took the mass killing for us to pay attention, to call attention to particular stereotypes and prejudice facing Asian women. And sometimes I want to say this, is that we pay attention to the visible sort of violence. But what I find a lot of us, what we experience is what we call the microaggression, right? The racialized microaggression essentially is racism, gendered or not, right? These are the things that daily, day in and day out, the little things that people do and act in response to you, those are the things that really cut our soul, that injure us deeply. And those both needs to be brought to the forefront. In addition to the visible violence that we're seeing in the media, but the daily racism that we experience in our daily life.
I'd like to add something to
go
that.
Ahead.
I think that that sometimes when we talk about intersectionality, it can almost feel like there's a little bit of an oppression Olympics going on, where something, this aspect that I'm experiencing because of my race is so much worse than this aspect of my gender is so much worse. But I think that if we bring awareness to both and allow sort of space for all of these different experiences to arise and listen to them and allow them within ourselves too, to understand that things are complex. It sort of goes to discussing dehumanization and why that sometimes happens. And sometimes that happens because we don't want to deal with complexity, right? We want to simplify our world as much as possible, because if we're always having to be present in every single moment and, humanize every single person we interact with, whether it's like that guy who cut us off in traffic or, the cashier that we're dealing with, it's like too much and it's overwhelming and too much information. And that's when we start to sort of flatten people. And sometimes when we talk about intersectionality, that can happen because then we start to sort of list off characteristics, they're female, they're Asian, they're this age, they have an accent or they don't, or, and sort of use those things as almost like a weird judgment tool. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what was the term you used? Oppression Olympics. I love that term. And yeah, I think what you're talking about, it's that chisel, the sort of daily and the microaggressions. You don't feel it right away, but at a certain point, it does overwhelm you because you've been sort of told over and over, that you are other, and you are not here. And no matter how you've tried to prove that. I want to talk about, there have been quite a lot of good questions, but I do want to talk about, where do we go from here? So we've sort of been specific about, the things that have happened. And I know, Sarah, you're actually from the Atlanta area and you have family there. So you would have felt this especially personally. I mean, how do we start healing from this?
So I think it's a really complex question and it'll be a little bit different for everyone, but I did want to bring up a couple of things here. I think that it's important to understand that we have some power over our own suffering. I think that's the key to begin healing in any sort of trauma. And that to know that sometimes when we're in a lot of pain, what we really crave is an acknowledgement of that pain, for people to see us as human. But what can be really powerful is actually if we acknowledge our own pain for ourselves. That, you know, if after a trauma, we can summon compassion for ourselves and sort of hold that place that hurts within us with tenderness and give ourselves that compassion that we're craving from, you know, the outside world. And I think that radical acceptance is often misunderstood as sort of forcing yourself to accept traumatic events because it happened in the past and there's nothing you can do about it. I think that that's a total misunderstanding of what radical acceptance and the power of what that could be. I think radical acceptance can be awareness and acknowledgement of your internal emotional state. It's showing yourself compassion for wherever you are in the process. It's allowing yourself space to feel anger, but also maintaining awareness of that anger so we can catch ourselves before it turns into self-harm. It's sort of accepting just any of the negative or positive emotions we're feeling in a moment-to-moment basis without judging it and without being hard on ourselves, like, oh, this happened 10 years ago, I should be over it. No, like, give yourself the space to feel what you feel, and give yourself the love that you are sometimes craving from you know, the outside world. And also the other day, my husband was teasing one of our dogs for one of her bad habits. And I responded, she's only human. And I think that we can always remind ourselves that we're only human and that we have limitations, and that to allow ourselves that space to be imperfect.
Absolutely. And to, you know, to leave the shame behind. I mean, it is a delicate balance, I have found, because if I am sitting here all day thinking about, you know, all of those things that have happened to me, it makes me probably not able to function. But at the same time, like, we can't forget it either, because like that's how we move forward. And on that, especially with, you know, with writing, like we're all pretty, I could guess that we're probably, I don't know if we're all introverts, but, you know, writing is such a solitary endeavor. You can't have anyone around you to do it. But activism, you know, is a really public one. And we also know that, you know, the publishing industry has this huge time lag between the creation and being out in the world. And it can feel kind of disconnected from things that have to be urgently addressed. And Usha, I wanted to ask you, because you have experience in activism, how do you combine the writing with the activism?
I think by basically realizing that they're both important, equally important to me as a writer, as a poet. They both define my role as a poet, because we might create in isolation, but then your work goes into the public, and then there's a whole journey towards that. And at that point, you are part of a larger community, whether the writing community or your own, you know, racial or ethnic community that you come with. So, you know, very early on, my co-director Pramila and I, as you know, we were very good friends. And there were issues that bothered us about the publishing industry, about being a writer in the United States. And we would often talk about our concerns. And that's how Matwala was born. You know, we realized we just couldn't wait around for someone to make the change that we wanted to see. So I think as poets and writers, it's kind of becoming inevitable that you're also activist. We have to create platforms for peace building. We have to create platforms for dialogue. We have to create platforms for visibility of minority writers. So I realized that being a poet in an isolated manner wasn't going to be enough. You know, it wasn't enough to be successful individually. I wanted to see more numbers. You know, when I open up the Norton anthology, I don't want to just see 1 or 2 South Asian writers. There are about 200 of us writing maybe today. So where are these writers? Where are they? You know, we're not profiled. We're not part of these anthologies. We're doing really good work. But where's the visibility? Where is the representation? So I was forced to encounter these questions in my journey. And then I didn't want to sit back and wait for someone to try and to make the change I wanted to see in the world in some way. So we're trying, you know, that's what we do. We want to try and change the canon a bit. We want to try and change representation. We want to try and change so many associated issues. So for example, are you forced, a very simple question to all of us as writers, right? Are you forced to change your subject matter to get published? Do we encounter this? Are we allowed to simply write from the voice we want to write? And if we do we get published? So do we alter that to be successful? You know, so we were encountering, Pramila, my co-director, and myself, we were encountering all these questions. And then what happens to integrity? How do you be an Indo-American writer? I've lived here for 30 years. I have to be American enough. I have to be Indian enough. And there's kind of flack from any departure you take. You know, you're either not too Indian, or you're not too American, or you're not enough Indian, or you're not enough American in your writing. But who lays out those guidelines? Who is the judge of all this? You know, so it's brought up so many questions. Being a writer, I don't have all the answers, but we're trying to answer some of them. You know, we're trying. So that's how Matwala was born. And I just want to say one thing to wrap up what I want to say. What we realized was very important. So it was created to increase the visibility of South Asian poetry. That's how we started Matwala. But with the events of the last 2 or 3 years, and especially from last year, the utter socio-political turbulence, the intolerance, the hate, the kind of atmosphere that's been building up, we realized that we couldn't work in a very isolated way only as South Asians anymore. So our 2021 and 22 festival, we're featuring poets of colors. We've just had a reading with African Americans. We're going to have Dalits, Native Americans, South and Central Americans, and Mexican poets. So we have 6 readings slotted for this year and next year, because we have to extend this, you know, hand of solidarity. We can't just be South Asian and limited within. We've realized to be who we are, we have to be it together in some way, you know. So that's the activism work that's going on.
I mean, that's so brilliant. I mean, the fact that you're demanding action, you did it. You didn't just think about it. And Michelle as well, you started the Red Envelope Stories. And I think, I know we're actually running out of time, but I did want to end on that key word from Usha, solidarity, because I think there are a lot of people in the chat who are asking, you know, what can we do to support this? And I think, first of all, we need the numbers. We need more and more people to pay attention, to support writers, to promote them and to make them visible. So I know, Kelly, you're back online. I think we're out of time. So I guess I wish I had 5 more hours. There is so much more to unpack, and I would love to continue having this conversation with all of you. But I just wanted to thank everyone, you know, for being so open to what's a really difficult conversation, but for having participated with so much generosity. I mean, I feel energized, inspired. I hope everyone else who was listening does too. And that's what this was all about. I think taking things that might seem unspeakable and putting words to them, because I think that's when we're specific, we're brave and we're open. And I think that's where the work begins. So I feel like this has been a tremendous start. Thank you.
On behalf of the International Women's Writing Guild, I first thank you to our listeners, all of you who are out there in our audience. You came and listened and asked wonderful questions, and your presence has been really heartening. We've had a wonderful crowd here today. Of course, we thank you, Yun, for your quick agreement and enthusiasm, and organization in helping to pull this together and then presenting and moderating, and your own reading today, which was really wonderful. And also for you, Ada and Usha and Michelle and Sarah, thank you. What a dynamic contribution you made for all of us today. I really want to thank Michelle Miller, our executive director, for caring about these issues and putting her own energies and vision into making sure these kinds of events happen, and then getting funding for them. How wonderful. And for Leslie, whose passion is always here, and the other board members of ours, of the Guild, who came and attended and who support all of these activities today. I do want to mention that this recording will be shared on our YouTube site, our International Women's Writing Guild YouTube site. So this is one action that I guess I would invite each one of you to take, is that when you get news that this recording has been uploaded and made available to the public, that if everybody who came today shared it on one of your social media presences, then other people might view it and then have the opportunity to really be really changed by all the voices that you heard today. So thank you. I know we're not going to be able to do a round of applause because Leslie, there's Leslie. Leslie, do you have a final word that you want to say?
Well, I've been in tears. I guess it was lucky that my face wasn't seen, but it's been a brilliant discussion. Please post your work, each of the panelists, on our IWWG Facebook page. We want to get your work out there. We want to get your words. And I will say that, and I hope you don't mind that I'll be reaching out for you to teach. Usha's teaching in July. And so if you get an email from me, don't turn away, because we want to share your voices more with the people who show up at our free writes and open mics featured readers. It was phenomenal. Thank you so much.
And
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
thank you, everyone. Goodbye. We will see you again.
Thank you.
The recording, Sipra, I will make, Michelle will be sending an email about how you can access the recording.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. It was
Thank you.
fantastic. It was fantastic, right?
We're still on, and so I'm going to end, and I'll
Yes,
open
thank
up
you.
I'll call everybody to a quick debriefing.
Okay, great. Thank